In this lesson, we'll talk about another of the common issues that is tested on sentence corrections in the executive assessment, and that's going to be modifiers. So, first, let's just recap the question logistics for these formats in the verbal section. So, as always, we know that you're going to assume 3 to 5 sentence corrections in the 14 question verbal section. You're going to have 1 to 3 of those sentence corrections in each 7 question half, and there is the least amount to read in this question format than any other verbal question format. And for that reason, strategically, you want to assume about 90 seconds per sentence correction, even though that's quite a bit lower than the just over 2 minutes per question average that you have in the verbal section. You want to have a maximum of 2 minutes for any of these question types because generally it doesn't get any easier if you just keep reading over and over between a couple of answer choices. You do want to minimize yourself to a single reread before you just eliminate and guess to save time. And remember that you can return back to the question if time allows within a given half. Do beware of just quote unquote listening for errors because unfortunately the ear we have for English tends to be kind of polluted by conversational structures that are allowed when you're just talking to a fellow individual, but aren't going to be allowed by the executive assessment. And you do want to look for differences instead that are going to indicate clinical possible common sense correction issues, including those affecting modifiers. So, how do we seek those modifier errors? First, you want to consider logical intent to proactively identify any true absurdity in the meaning as presented. You'll then also want to carefully evaluate any introductory or concluding descriptive phrases to make sure that that introductory phrase describes the immediately following item or that the concluding phrase does the same to whatever immediately preceded it. You'll also want to be really attentive in noting subtle changes in the choices that are affecting single descriptive words. So that means like there's one word that's changing, often from like a more to a most or a like realist to real. And you're like, okay, that's going to change the meaning. And you've got to try to determine which is actually preferable based on the original. Now, strategically, this means that modifiers are a commonly tested issue for longer underlines. It just so happens that when you're moving entire phrases, you often need to underline more if you're the exam. So if you've got a long underline, you really want to make sure that any modifying phrases are properly placed to describe their intended object or subject. You also can stop and eliminate the choices as soon as you clearly identify an absurd modifier. So once the state of New Jersey has no predators in the wild, you go, wait a minute, that's not what that's intending to say. And you can immediately go, that's wrong, and allow yourself to eliminate answer choices that repeat that categorical error. You have to focus on intended meaning, however, rather than on abstract grammar to find these errors. So you want to make sure that you're not just trying to memorize some weird grammatical rules when dealing with modifiers and instead kind of critically think about what the sentence is trying to articulate. You do, of course, have to read your choice back into the original sentence to avoid overlooking possible absurdities. And this is important when you're combining modifier errors with other categorical issues, especially those top 3 issues of subject verb agreement, verb tense, and pronoun or article issues, because you can get a little bit over focused on issues of like matching pronouns or articles or verb tenses or subjects and verbs. And you can kind of overlook an absurd modifier if you're not really paying attention to the intent of the sentence. So this is your last opportunity to potentially catch it by reading the sentence with your choice to make sure that you're not overlooking some absurdity if you've been focused on some other issue. And you also have to beware of a rather technical issue that comes up on some of the harder sentence corrections, which is misusing adjectives or adverbs as modifiers. We'll get into this in greater detail here in a moment, but basically it means you can't use an adjective when you should use an adverb or vice versa. So let's first talk about what happens with incorrect modifying phrases, starting with what are known as dangling modifiers. So that introduces the question of what happens if a modifier has no target. So let's consider an example sentence. Thinking of 1987, many memories came back. Now, you may be like, that sounds like a fine sentence, but let's ask the question, who's thinking of 1987? In this sentence alone, No one. We don't have anybody who could be possibly thinking of 1987, and that makes this an incomplete sentence because no one in this sentence is clearly thinking of 1987 because many memories cannot be thinking of anything. Many memories are the thoughts themselves. So we could instead have a sentence that went, thinking of 1987, I had many memories come back, and that clarifies who's thinking of 1987. I am. Alternatively, we could have a sentence such as, thinking of 1987, Ed had many memories come back. Now we've answered the question with who's thinking of 1987? Ed is. You have to make sure that your modifiers have a clear, unambiguous target and not overlook and kind of fill it in yourself by thinking that a sentence such as thinking of 1987, many memories came back is acceptable because it had no target for that modifier that was introducing the sentence, and that's going to cause some ambiguity that the exam definitely does not like. Now, what happens instead if you misplace a modifier? Well, that too can cause some confusion. So let's look at another example. So we've got the sentence, Walt saw a dog driving down the street. Well, who's driving? Depending on where we move this modifier of driving down the street, we could have two really different sentences. So the more conventional would be a change to something such as driving down the street, Walt saw a dog. Well, driving down the street clearly now is modifying or describing Walt as the actor, and we know that while Walt was driving, Walt saw a dog. Clarifies the ambiguity. Alternatively, we could have a sentence that read, Walt saw a dog that was driving down the street. Well, now we truly have news. A dog is driving down the street, and Walt saw that dog while it was driving down the street, and Walt wasn't necessarily driving. So you have to make sure that your modifiers have no ambiguity in their placement. And if you misplace a modifier, you can introduce ambiguity or just have a truly absurd meaning. Now, what happens if a modifier, potentially as small as an individual adjective or adverb, is in between two possible logical objects or subjects? So let's consider an example. Workers at the office occasionally eat popcorn. Well, now we have the question of what's the occasion? Because is it that the workers are occasionally at the office or that they occasionally eat popcorn? We've got an ambiguity that needs to be clarified. So we could have a rewrite that changes it to occasionally workers at the office eat popcorn. And that clarifies the occasion is the eating popcorn because all workers at the office, as this is written, occasionally eat the popcorn. Simple enough. Alternatively, we could change it to workers occasionally at the office, meaning that if they're occasionally at the office, not all the time, they eat popcorn. So now, for whatever reason, full-time workers don't eat popcorn, but if you're only occasionally at the office, you do eat popcorn. You need to clarify these sorts of ambiguities between what are known as squinting modifiers that could refer to either what comes before or after. So let's take a look at an example. As always, we'll read the sentence as written first. Sometimes called California's Galapagos, the Channel Islands are home to unique plants and animals in varieties nowhere else, as well as others that are closely related to mainland species. So you first have to ensure that any introductory modifying clause is properly describing the next nearest item. And in this case, California's Galapagos is modifying the Channel Islands. And that makes sense. And you have to just focus on intended meaning more than on abstract grammar rules to recognize these kinds of errors. And if we look at the answer choices once they're brought in, we've got a few answer choices that have things that wouldn't make sense to be called California's Galapagos because a thing has to be called California's Galapagos. And it has to probably be another proper noun. So we can eliminate choices that create logically absurd descriptions, such as calling home to a variety of unique plants and animals California's Galapagos. That doesn't make any sense. Unique plants and animals are not going to be called California's Galapagos either, and a variety of unique plants and animals is also not going to be called California's Galapagos, so we can eliminate choices C, D, and E, each for creating an absurd definition. Then we have to make sure that we match the intended meaning, not just before, but also after the underlined portion. So we see that we're ultimately comparing to others that are closely related to mainland species in the non-underlined portion. And we've got home to unique plants and animals in varieties in the original. And you can't have varieties be other varieties that are closely related to mainland species. You can't have a variety that's related to a species. That doesn't make logical sense either, so we can eliminate choice A. Of course, we then look at choice B and we've got unique plants and animals. And those unique plants and animals could also be compared to other unique plants and animals that are closely related to mainland species. So they're plants and animals that are related to others. That makes logical sense. We want to read our choice back into the sentence, confirm that coherence though. So sometimes called California's Galapagos, the Channel Islands are home to a variety of unique plants and animals found nowhere else, as well as others that are closely related to mainland species. And that does create a coherent narrative for the overall sentence and can confidently be selected as our correct answer at this point. So now we get to that more technical issue of modification, which is the difference between adjectives and adverbs. So adjectives can only describe nouns or pronouns. That's it. So we could have something such as the quick cat or the hungry bird, because both quick and hungry are adjectives, and cat and bird are obviously nouns, persons, places, or things. You can also use adjectives with linking verbs to create descriptors. So you could say something such as the cat is quick or the bird is hungry. So you'd say the cat is the thing of quick, quick still being an adjective, but now it's turned into the thing that the cat is, or the hungry is the thing that the bird is, and that too is a completely acceptable convention of English. And you also have to make sure that you're being very consistent when you use what are known as comparatives or superlatives. So generally, a comparative is going to end in ER. A superlative is going to end in EST. It's basically the difference between more and most, as it were. So you can't have a consistent meaning, however, between the quicker cat and the quickest cat. So if the original were quicker and you switch in an answer choice to quickest, that can be eliminated almost immediately because we know that changes the meaning. Because the quicker cat means that we are comparing, hence the term comparative, one cat to another. That's the only way that that structure will work. Whereas the quickest cat means out of all the cats. And that's a superlative, again, hence the term super in superlative. It is the quickest cat out of all of them. And again, you just have to be careful to make sure that you don't subtly change here. They're not necessarily going to test all that frequently the proper usage, but you do recognize that a comparative has to compare one thing versus another thing, whereas a superlative just says in general that this is the quickest cat on earth, apparently. Now, an adverb, however, for the purposes of this exam, and it is a little bit of an oversimplification, is just going to describe all other parts of speech. So it's just not going to describe nouns or pronouns. So adverbs are generally going to end with the suffix ly. So we'll use the word or the adjective quick as our exemplar here. So the correct adverb would create a sentence such as the cat moves quickly. So the cat moves quickly is proper because quickly is describing how the cat moves, no longer the cat itself. So quickly describes the verb of moves, and therefore we need that adverb instead of an adjective. An incorrect adjective usage instead would be the cat moves quick. Now, conversationally, you're probably not going to stop somebody that said that phrase or sentence to you and say, "What do you mean?" You're going to be able to interpret what they're intending. But on the exam, you can't incorrectly use an adverb when an adjective is necessary, nor an adjective when an adverb would be necessary. So this, again, is a very subtle difference that can be kind of exploited by the exam in some of the harder sentence corrections. So let's take a look at one more sample sentence correction. And as always, we read the sentence as it's originally written first. So most currently research, including chemical ecology research at Palmer Station and other sites along the western Antarctic Peninsula, is carried out in open water without solid overhead ice cover, and the equipment and techniques are very much like those used in colder temperate waters. So, as I said, this idea of the grammar adjective versus adverb is generally only an issue for some of the harder sentence corrections. So that being the second half of the verbal section for the EA. But you need to carefully track your descriptors and determine if the object or subject that is trying to describe requires an adjective or an adverb. So we can see that the object of the descriptors in the underline is research. So we just got to make sure, since research is a noun, that we're only describing it with adjectives. So most is fine. Most is an adjective, describes research. But currently, we just established if it ends in ly, it's almost certainly going to be an adverb. And in this case, currently definitely is an adverb and is being incorrectly used to modify the noun of research, so we can eliminate both choices that use currently incorrectly. We also have to make sure that no choices confuse the originally intended meaning. And if we were to put in choice C, most is current research, now we've introduced a question. Most of what is current research? By introducing that verb, or like most is current research, well, again, most of what? And we don't want that ambiguity. We just want to characterize most research at Palmer Station, not most of something else is research at Palmer Station. So we can eliminate choice C for introducing that confusion. Then you have to be careful of subtly changing the meaning by switching from the comparative to the superlative or vice versa. So in our original, we had most currently research. We knew currently was wrong, but most was fine. So you can't subtly change from most to now more. So then, as always, you need to read your choice into the sentence to confirm it captures the original intent. Most current research, including chemical ecology research at Palmer Station and other sites. Again, everything after other sites here is going to describe those sites and the research, and is no longer going to affect the underline, so you can potentially expedite the process for a sentence correction such as this, where there's a really short underline portion and a non-underline portion that isn't going to affect it. Once you've fixed the issue and you're confident that the remaining information isn't going to affect that decision, you can just select your choice once you've eliminated everything else. So, just in summary, how can we work through evaluating modifiers? First, carefully read the sentences written to ensure that all modifying phrases describe the nearest possible item in the sentence without introducing any sort of absurdity. You need to focus on the intended meaning to eliminate choices creating that logically absurd meaning if it occurs, however. And then, if subtle changes of individual descriptive words happen in the choices, you need to confirm proper adjective or adverb use and potentially superlative or comparative use. And lastly, of course, read your selection back into the sentence to ensure it logically captures the intent of the original without any subtle changes in meaning. Again, possibly adverb adjective, possible absurdity when we're talking about modifiers, and possible differences between superlatives and comparatives. So, we've talked about how modifiers are going to be tested on the executive assessment in sentence corrections. Let's move on over to the whiteboard and take a look at a couple of examples to see how you'll execute in evaluating this specific type of issue for sentence corrections on the EA. Here we have a sample sentence correction, and let's set up the scratch pad as we do for every problem. We got A, B, C, D, E, and we put a little line over top for any error if we identify it. So, as always, read the sentence as it's presented first. Southern South America today has a highly diverse of environments, biomes, and biotas that are probable as the result of the complex interactions of plants and animals with several geological forces. Now, in this sentence, there are a couple of different issues that we can focus on, but let's just look at the conclusion. We've got are probable. Well, probable is an adjective, and that has to describe a noun, and there's no noun next to this probable. We've got are, which is a verb, and as, which is a conjunction. So there's not any noun that probable can actually be modifying. So we've found one of those more difficult to identify grammatical modifier errors. So we know that the probable here is incorrect. And we can see that we've got a probable that's wrong in A, we've got a probable that's wrong in B, and highly probable is still incorrect because highly can describe a noun or an adjective, or sorry, highly can describe an adjective as an adverb, but that probable still has no object that it can modify. So that's going to be incorrect as well. So we can eliminate A, B, and E all for this one issue. Now, then we want to look at the differences between C and D, and there are very few of them, and it can be really hard to identify that in D we've got a highly diverse environment, biome, and biota, whereas in C we've got diverse environments, biomes, and biotas. You have to remember that you're going to need to default to the original sentence when it comes to issues of meaning, and we can see in the original that there were environments, biomes, and biotas. So we can't subtly change to a single environment, biome, and biota. Additionally, we know that a highly diverse environment, biome, and biota would be kind of difficult to accomplish because you'd be talking about diversity within one thing as opposed to a diverse multitude of things as we have in choice C. So as always, we'll read our answer back into the original to confirm that it captures the intended meaning. So, Southern South America has highly diverse environments, biomes, and biotas, probably as the result of the complex interactions of plants and animals with several geological forces. And that captures the original intent without changing the meaning. And you'll note it is a little bit more succinct. We don't need a today here. That today is redundant. It can be really difficult to identify that in the original sentence until you compare it to the other answer choices, but recognize that shorter is generally better provided that we don't have any confusion introduced by any of the omissions, and we can confidently select C as the most concise and correct answer for this sentence correction. So let's move on down and take a look at one more little problem, and this is one of my favorites because when you catch an absurd modifier, it may actually kind of encourage you to let out a little stifled chuckle on the exam. So setting up the scratch work, we've got A through E here, and we read from the beginning. Before scuba diving, American lobsters proliferated in the Gulf of Maine. Wait a minute, what? We have scuba diving American lobsters? That's kind of crazy. And this would be a textbook absurd modifier. The exam doesn't want you to believe there are scuba diving American lobsters. That makes no earthly sense. We can't anthropomorphize non humans. There's not going to be a non human that's scuba diving in the Gulf of Maine and they'd proliferate on their own. That's really kind of disturbing if we've got mollusks that are proliferating on their own and using diving equipment. So we can eliminate choice A for that absurd modifier as soon as we find it without even reading the rest of the sentence as originally presented. And we then want to go find if there are any other scuba diving American lobsters in our other answer choices. And here we've got scuba diving American lobsters once again in choice B. In choices C, D, and E, we at least just have American lobsters in the Gulf of Maine that aren't necessarily scuba diving, and the scuba diving's been properly separated from those lobsters. So now we'll go look at the other answer choices. And again, consider the category of modifier to determine where an issue or error might be occurring. So we can see here in the other answer choices that the word before is subtly moving in the options. So in C, we've got American lobsters in the Gulf of Maine before scuba diving proliferated were assumed to have a relatively homogeneous population. And it's pretty much the same thing, although it varies a little bit before the proliferation as opposed to proliferated in choice D. But the original, it was before scuba diving, and there needed to be like a comma or some extra descriptors or conjunctions, transitions, some way to differentiate the scuba diving from the lobsters. But it's before scuba diving in the original that the American lobsters were assumed to have a relatively homogeneous population. And so if we move that before to after the lobsters are introduced, now it makes it seem like the activity of scuba diving is uh, describing the lobsters still, although kind of strangely. So we're not trying to say that American lobsters before scuba diving were different than American lobsters after scuba diving. It's that the proliferation of scuba diving itself allowed for a change in the assumption. So both choices C and D still have absurd modifiers. They're just a little bit more subtle than the original one that had American lobsters that were participating in some interesting diving activities. So as always, you want to read your choice back into the original, or in this case, when the entire sentence is underlined, the whole thing, to confirm that it doesn't have any other errors, especially around the categorical issue of modification that we identified. So before the proliferation of scuba diving, American lobsters in the Gulf of Maine, so clearly describing the lobsters in that specific area, were assumed to have a relatively homogeneous population. So now we can see that it's because of the proliferation of scuba diving that we were to change the assumptions about the lobsters rather than that the lobsters themselves were affected by said scuba diving. And that is the intended meaning of the original and our correct answer. So go ahead and practice some of your own modification sentence corrections in our question bank to improve your performance with this particular meaning-based issue that you'll encounter on the verbal section of the test.